Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at marriage in our continuing study of biblical ethics. You might think, why is marriage even an ethical issue? But there are going to be several that are within this realm, and we're only going to look at a few right now. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 sets forth the origins and the basis and the foundation of marriage, where we read that God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And then it actually takes place. The plan is given in verse 26, but then the completion of that plan, verse 27, "And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him," just as he had planned. But now we see this idea, male and female, he created them. And so this is the first mention of what's going to be marriage, male and female. Notice it's not male and male or female and female. The genders were created appropriately. If that hadn't been the case, the human race could have died right there. But it didn't, because God made it to function accordingly. Now we get to chapter 2 and verse 18, and we're not going to go through all that chapter. We could have read the whole thing, but I'll refer you to my study in Genesis for that. Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, "Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him.'" That is, you have in Genesis chapter 1 just sort of the whole picture. Now we get into specifics where God makes man and now notes that it's not good for man to be alone, and a helper is ordained and is going to be made for him. Notice it's not good. This is following all throughout chapter 1 where we have God made light and it was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God made dry land and it was good, and God made the great lights and the lesser lights and they were good, and everything is good, it's good, it's good. But now we see that it's not good for the man to be alone. We are created as a social animal, not that we're animals necessarily, a social being, and beyond that, we're made for one another, that is, in the area of gender. Verse 21, "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and then he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. And the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man." Now it's striking that we see the woman taken from the side of man, especially when we remember how Jesus on the cross had an injury to his side. There's a sense in which as Jesus was on the cross, he was purchasing himself he was purchasing for himself a bride, and for that bride to be brought forth, he had to, can I say it this way? He had to fall into a deep sleep. He had to die, and then from his side was taken his bride, that is, the church. Well, chapter 2, verse 23 continues. We have I think this is really a song almost. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman." I love the Hebrew there. She shall be called Isha, because she was taken out of, and the Hebrew word for man, and masculine man is Ish. Ish is sort of masculine man, Ish. Isha, that sounds very feminine. And she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And so we have the ordinance of the first marriage. Verse 24, here's the ordinance. "For this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." That is, this one flesh relationship is to consummate this idea of marriage, where a man and a woman come together, and they are joined together to form a new family. Notice it, again, it's not a man and a man or a woman and a woman. God designed it in a certain way, and that's the way it's appropriate for it to take place. Verse 25, "And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Now, we're not going to read everything that takes place in chapter 3, but notice that there's no shame. Their bodies are open to each other, not to anyone else, but to each other, and yet there's no shame in that. And so there's there's a picture of an appropriate union, an appropriate joining of the husband and the wife. Now, the question comes up, how did the fall affect marriage? Well, let's look at that. We get to chapter 3 and verse 16. This is after they've already eaten of the forbidden fruit, and God shows up, and he speaks to the serpent, and now he speaks to the woman. And to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. What we have there is synonymous parallelism. Again, it's given in sort of a poetic stance. And in Hebrew poetry, you always have parallelism in Hebrew poetry. And in this case, it's synonymous parallelism. That is, you say something in the first line, and then you say it with different words, but essentially the same idea in the second line. That's what's taking place here. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. And then you say the same thing, in pain you'll bring forth children. It means the same thing. That's not a new meaning. It's not a different meaning. It means essentially the same thing. But then in the bottom part of the verse, we have a second line of parallelism. This time, I'm going to suggest this is antithetical parallelism. Notice God says, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. By antithesis, I mean that it's not saying the same thing, it's saying opposite things. The same truth, but said in opposite terms. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Those are two different ideas. What does that mean? People have struggled, with the meaning here. They've struggled to understand this, and I think it's very simple. First of all, the last line is pretty easy throughout most of human history. Men have ruled over women. It's not saying it's right. It's not saying it's wrong. It's just saying it is. That's the way history has generally gone throughout history. That men have ruled, and sometimes rather harshly, sometimes very harshly, but men have ruled over women. But notice the first line, yet your desire will be for your husband. Even though there's this idea that men have ruled sometimes very harshly over women, yet there's this strange phenomenon that's taken place at the same time throughout history. Women still want husbands. And yes, I know there's exceptions to that, but generally speaking, if that weren't true, then the human race would have stopped existing a long time ago. And even to this day, the general rule, at least, is that women still want husbands, even though sometimes men don't act very, very nicely. Now, I'm jumping forward to the New Testament, the words of the Apostle Paul, and the reason I'm jumping forward is because he's going to quote the same passage, and he's speaking about the marital relations and men and women and husbands and wives. And in that context, Paul says, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. Now, that's not very politically correct in our 21st century culture. But Paul says it. Of course, he's not saying it in 21st century culture. He's saying it in a culture back then. And even back then, depending on who you talk to, it might not have been all that politically correct, depending on who was his audience. But he says it nevertheless. A woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. He goes on to say, verse 12, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. And you say, well, wait a minute, aren't there exceptions to that? For example, in the Old Testament, there were people like Deborah, who was a judge, exercised authority. There was Esther, not necessarily in authority, but exercised influence, certainly. Even in Paul's day, there were Aquila and also Priscilla, and we read that both of them, not just Aquila, but Aquila and Priscilla, both we read about them taking Apollos under their wing and training him more accurately in the gospel, in the truth. Well, what about those exceptions? And I think Paul would have said, well, yeah, those are exceptions, but generally speaking, notice how he says it, verse 12, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over men, but to remain quiet. What's that about? Well, the next verse, verse 13, he links the reason for that not to something that's cultural in his day, but to that creation ordinance. So he says, verse 13, for it was Adam who first was created, And then Eve. Now that has nothing to do with sin. That's just the way they were created. But also verse 14, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. So there was something about the order of creation, but also the events of the fall. Verse 15, and verse 15 is puzzling as well. But women will be preserved. The Greek text actually used the word sozo there to save. Can I translate it that way? But women will be saved. Now that doesn't mean eternal salvation, spiritual salvation. But there's something from which women will be preserved or saved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. Of what is that speaking? Well, we have to go back to the context. Notice a few verses earlier, Paul said that he does not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. But here is the exception, except in the area of raising children, because after all, even men start off with mothers who exercise authority over them. And so here, we have a saying. It's an old American saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And there's a sense in which Paul's alluding to that same truth right here. That there's an incredible area that, generally speaking, I know there's exceptions, for various reasons, but generally speaking, women have a great influence over not just girls, but men and women, because both men and women all started off with mothers. It's a calling. It is a calling.